What if one of America's most powerful foreign policy tools stopped taking orders from the US government? What if a federal agency funded by taxpayers started pushing political agendas abroad against the wishes of the US president? That's not a conspiracy theory. That's USAID. Hello, my name is Cameron. I'm a former fraud prevention officer, and I help people to get visas to the United States. Originally launched during the Cold War as part of JFK's soft power initiative to win the hearts and minds,
all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
USAID was supposed to be independent, and that pulls well with Americans, but unfortunately, USAID became a rogue agency. The United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, was created in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy as part of his soft power initiative. The idea was to win over hearts and minds of the developing world, not through war, but through, well, money. So they were supposed to help build wells, participate in disaster relief, and just make America look good in the eyes of local citizens. The agency was supposed to be independent because there was always concerns about spying at U.S. embassies, so the U.S. wanted an agency that they could point to see, no, they're independent of the State Department. They're not spying. Although there's been reports that they were spying, we're not going to talk about that in this video. Like many things in government, good intentions often lead to horrible outcomes. Here's the thing, USAID had money, political cover, independence, and over time, host nations couldn't tell where US diplomacy ended and USAID activism began. USAID went from a partner of the ambassadors to a foe. Here are just a few examples of how they let their personal ideologies damage US foreign policy and US interest abroad. In 2014, when Uganda passed its Anti-Homosexuality Act, it passed overwhelmingly in Parliament with, I think it was 389 votes for and 2 against. The Ugandan public wildly supported these policies. However, USAID began funding LGBT groups that were openly opposed to President Museveni. It doesn't take a genius to see how that hurts U.S. foreign policy in Uganda. Not just about being LGBT or not, but then Museveni was able to say, see, these Westerners are trying to destroy our way of life. And that doesn't help anybody, including LGBT Ugandans. It's the same story in Kenya and the Dominican Republic. In Bolivia, they funneled money to groups opposing President Evo Morales. In Pakistan, USAID accidentally funded radical elements. In Guatemala, USAID funded anti-corruption initiatives, but these actually turned out to be far-left political groups who were trying to overthrow the president. Now, technically, the ambassador is head of mission. This was codified into law in the Foreign Service Act of 1980, which specifically states, the chief of mission under the direction of the president shall have full responsibility for the direction, coordination, and supervision of all United States government executive branch employees in that country, except for employees under the command of the United States Area Military Commander. The ambassador is supposed to be the voice of the president, and they get the final say in U.S. policy in those countries. However, USAID often cited its independence and funded groups that were opposed to U.S. diplomatic interests. This left ambassadors in an untenable position where they had to hold the bag and they had to explain to foreign governments why USAID was funding organizations that were openly hostile to them. It got so bad that U.S. ambassadors started airing their grievances publicly. An often cited anonymous quote from a U.S. ambassador says, "You tell the USAID mission director to stop funding something, and he'd say, I'll need to run that by Washington." It was maddening. One ambassador didn't mince words. Ambassador Princeton Liam said, "There was constant tension. USAID thought they'd answer to Washington, not to us. Ambassador William J. Burns said, "You cannot run effective foreign policy when aid programs are marching to a different drummer than diplomacy." Former Ambassador Ronald Newman said, "There are times when USAID was treated by its staff as a wholly separate entity. That was never how the embassy worked." And then you had directors like Samantha Power and Rajiv Shah who openly encouraged staff to prioritize programs like racial equity, LGBT, climate policy that weren't necessarily aligned with U.S. diplomatic interests. These moves were often criticized as neo-cultural colonialism. A GAO report said that USAID State Department rivalry leads to duplication, inconsistent messages, and lost strategic opportunities. Colin Powell, who was a Bush appointee who later endorsed Obama, said, "We cannot conduct foreign policy with 180 independent fiefdoms overseas." The culture clash was extreme. Diplomats focused on state-to-state relations. USAID wanted to empower grassroots opposition. One side worked through governments, the other often worked against them. It got so bad that there became a bipartisan push for reform. In 1998, Congress passed the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act. It brought oversight, but USAID remained largely independent. The State Department could advise, but they couldn't actually tell USAID what to do. And in 2006, reforms like the F Bureau tried to bring budget and strategy under one roof, but the reality on the ground didn't change much. USAID continued to operate with minimal embassy coordination. So you have a recalcitrant government agency that is staffed by radical ideologues who have resisted reforms from Congress, have ignored ambassadors. In short, USAID had become a problem. In longer form, USAID had become a bipartisan problem. So that is why in 2025, when President Trump took office, he signed an executive order ordering a pause of all USAID expenditures. The way the government in a constitutional democracy is supposed to work is that the bureaucrats will grumble, but follow the president's orders. However, that's not what happened. The bureaucrats found workarounds to continue pushing out funds, often through third-party contractors or ambiguous development categorizations. So now you have an agency that has resisted Congress, undermined ambassadors, and defied the orders of the President of the United States. This should be disturbing regardless of who you voted for. And that gave President Trump cover to shut down the agency. To be clear, he didn't actually shut it down. He appointed a director, Peter Morocco, who essentially gutted the agency. In addition, the funds were redirected and it was put back under the Department of State. While publicly, most diplomats probably lean left, privately, they were very happy that U.S. foreign policy was now under one roof. If you found this video to be interesting, my name is Cameron. I'm a former fraud prevention officer. I now do visas. If you want to get a visa for your partner to come to the United States, specifically the CR1 or the K1, book a consultation with me at busybodivisa.com. Thank you.